Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are on, I guess, week 3 of book club. We're doing chapters 8 and 9. And I'm excited today because I felt like even on the schedule, there were 3 chapters. And after last week, I was like, getting through 3 chapters was a lot. So this week, I'm feeling like we can kind of slow down the pace. Very excited about being able to go through basically chapter 8 is about shaping, so gentle shaping, right? This whole book is just so friendly towards your nervous system and towards change. And it's this gentle shaping with attention and intention. And then chapter 9 is about storytelling, so restorying. Um, so, yeah, with gentle shaping, it is not something that we're expecting to be a quick dramatic process. Now, of course, sometimes we can have a lot of insights and quick changes and we start to feel better and better, but we also just want to be so patient with our nervous system because these patterns are there to protect us, and they're happening subconsciously, and we're just grooming them over time to kind of shape them into the ways that are more safe feeling, anchored in safety. Yeah. So when she talks about positive feedback loops, which I love because it's just basically what you focus on, you create more of, which is law of attraction. But when you get your momentum going in a certain direction, you'll keep having a positive feedback loop in that direction. Doesn't mean that everything that is a positive feedback loop is positive. It could be someone didn't text me back, and then I start thinking nobody likes me, and then I go further into freeze and I think it's just hopeless, and that could be a positive feedback loop. Basically just call it a feedback loop if it's confusing, or you could call it law of attraction or just like your momentum. But just noticing how again, kind of what you focus on, you create more of. We know that from neuroplasticity. What we wire and fire more and more often expands and wires and fires together and gets really strong. So we can use that spiral to, just kind of notice that that is what goes on and hopefully stop it earlier in the process sometimes. We're not going to be perfect about it, but with this awareness, it's definitely easier to stop that spiral or get off of it before you go, spiraling out of control in this kind of subconscious way. Okay. And then I love this, to stretch, not stress. Okay. Because so much of the time, our sweet meaning selves, our high achieving, we go into flight and we're like, let me just solve this problem. And we're stressing ourselves out, and then our nervous system responds with more dysregulation and shutdown. So you can usually start to feel the difference in your body between something that feels like a stretch. Maybe some of you I know are coaches. And so maybe like, sending an email that makes an offer feels like a stretch, but something else like doing some kind of post or something might feel like a stress. And just to honor that, over time, our capacities will grow. But again, the more we're like forceful and trying to, judge where we're at and be better, we'll actually, have a harder time in this process of shaping gently, right? It's a gentle shaping. So I thought we could take a moment and do this exercise together. She talks about this stretch and stress continuum. So if you have a paper right there, you could write a line across, a horizontal line, and on one end is stretch, and on the other end is survive. And then near the middle, so it goes stretch and then savor, and then stress and survive. So between savor and stress, in that middle area is your window of tolerance. And you'll we can start by the way she describes it. I'm going to see, she has these cute names and also images that she thought of for these different parts of the continuum. So on the stretch side, that's like a kite flying at the end of a string. I love that one. So the kite's flying, it's soaring around, but it's also anchored, right? It's on this string, so it's just like stretching. And then a nautilus shell for savor. So the savoring is, more in that ventral state. And then a jagged heart, she says, for stress. And then that hollow-eyed emoji for the dorsal state of survive. So as you see, like sorry, it wasn't just the thing in the middle is the regulated state or window of tolerance. It's everything to the left. So even stretch and savor, like those could be within the ventral state. Maybe that was confusing using that term window of tolerance. But so the ventral state would be the stretch and savor. But then when it crosses over into stress, that's more the sympathetic. And then survive, if you keep stressing and stressing, you ultimately collapse and go into the shutdown, which is the dorsal. So when we had those images of what she had before with the dog was the ventral and the shark was the stress, was the sympathetic, and the turtle was the survive, like that could be some images. Did anyone come up with any other like images that came to them? If you want to share in the chat, you can. Because sometimes our own little creativity can come up with something else that is more relevant to us. Okay. So we're going to do a little activity now that you've drawn that, walking along the line with your fingers. And so we're going to explore the sensations, the thoughts, the types of feelings, the stories that come up when we're in the different parts of this continuum. So if you start with thinking the beginning of the line. So, actually, let's see. Sorry, let's start at the midpoint of the line. So that middle place where you feel regulated, you don't feel stressed, you're just kind of in this ventral place, balance. And maybe you can think of a time of your life that you were in that in real life. And now if you place one finger on either side of that point, one on the stretch side and one on the savor side, imagine feeling the different energies between those two, right? So we've talked about the stress, that's that activation, it's the sympathetic. And then the savor might be leaning into that regulation a little bit more, feeling more safe. So how does it feel? Can you feel differences between those two fingers as you imagine them? Oh, someone had a smile for savor. Ooh, I love that. Because that savoring almost makes me think of like eating and enjoying like deliciousness to the mouth. Yeah. So how did that go? That's an interesting thing, right? To just like imagine the different energies. Did anyone feel different within those two fingers? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. And then I want you to walk your finger over to the stretch side of the line. And I want you to think of a time in your life, in real life, maybe recently, that you've felt you've gone from that totally safe, savoring place to a little bit stretchy, right? You're kind of challenging yourself a little, but still anchored in that safety. And Wendy says savor definitely feels safe and at home. Yeah, it could be like a home. Okay, so as you're feeling that stretch and putting your finger over on that side of the line, feel any differences that you notice, maybe in your body, and also the anchoring that you have, that you're still on that side of safety. Did anyone think of an example that came to mind? And does that make sense to think of the stretch versus doing it out of fear and a survival response? Totally different, right? Okay, and then we're gonna take the finger over and we're going to, stay anchored. We're going to tiptoe. She always says we're kind of like just um, dipping the toe in or starting to notice those places of change at the edge where it changes from the regulated, savor, and safe feeling into stress. And what kinds of things are markers for that for you? How do you start to know that you're crossing that midpoint? Maybe your heart starts to race. Maybe there's certain type of thoughts that you think like, "Oh, I've got to get more done, or I'm got to figure this out," or um I'm just need to do more, or some kind of fear like, they're against me. Yeah. Throat tightens, shoulder tension. Yeah. So interesting, right? Definitely feel it in the body. Okay. So when you're she even says, how does your nervous system let you know you've crossed the midpoint and you're no longer in a shaping practice? So, even thinking of like the other side is this shaping practice. And then when we cross over into the stress and into the survive, we're no longer in that shaping. We're just, that's what's taking over. Wendy says, stretch feels flexible. The stretch reminds me of a dolphin. That's the image that came to mind. Going over the line, my throat is tight. Feel my tummy engage and my forehead squint. Yeah. So interesting now that we're like doing this, and I've been tracking my emotions on that How We Feel app. And I've noticed so many times a little like jaw tension or just body tension that now I'm just like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that I was holding that little level of stress. But once I identified the emotion and then I checked in with my body, I'm like, oh, my quads don't need to be tight right now while I'm just laying here. Um, yeah, hypervigilant, not compassionate. Yes. And it's so good to know that, because remember, you guys, the state that we're in determines how we're even seeing the world, how we're interpreting people's actions, how we're reading the email that comes to us. Like, it's so good to know when we're in those states so that we can not take as seriously all the information that we're starting to believe, right? So that's why these stories and the way that we start to have these feedback loops are so important. And just starting to recognize, oh, when I feel rejected, I start thinking everyone's against me. And then I think I'm no good at anything I do. And then I think, you know what I mean? Like, I know this spiral for myself. I'm not a good coach. I'm not a good mom. I'm not a good yoga teacher. People hate everything about me, like it just like spirals. Forehead squint. Yes. The app that I mentioned is called How We Feel, and it's a free app, and you can track your emotions. It helps you label them. If you look at it and know nervous system stuff, you can just see the different nervous system states too, if it's regulated or not, and if it's high energy or low energy. Yeah, and Wendy, that was me last week doing a bit of the spiral. Yeah. So it's so good to just start to, again, notice, oh, Wendy, shallow breathing. Yeah. Notice those little things so that then again, you're just like, oh, that's what's going on. That makes total sense. I noticed one thing with me is like when I start to feel unsafe and like I don't have a lot of support, I automatically am like, oh, my kids probably feel so unsafe. And I notice that starts to happen because I get coached regularly. And I was like, oh my gosh, here I am thinking this again, and this is a pattern that I do. And so good to know that, so that I'm not coming from this reactive place and, you know what I mean, making these problems where there aren't any. Because really, my kids were giving me no sign. It was just I was in that state. So I assumed they were too, or something. Yeah. And you don't notice the shallow breathing until you're calmer. Exactly. So there might even be like so much of it happens and we're just so used to it going on that we don't even realize those subtle signs. It's like instead of a road that we feel the rumble strips as we're going off the freeway, we like don't realize until we're clear out in the weeds, and then we're like, oh, I'm off the freeway. But as we get more sensitive, then we start to notice those rumble strips, and we can just get back on the freeway a lot easier, unless there's just a lot of momentum. That can happen too still, but doesn't happen nearly as often and not as subconsciously. Okay, so let's track all the way over with your finger, slide it all the way over to survive. And again, that is more the collapse, the dorsal, the shutdown. That's like things are hopeless. It's never going to work. I'm not good enough. It's just too much. I'm too confused. I'm not capable enough to do this. Maybe you feel some differences in your body, your posture. You think of the kind of beliefs that are common for you, the kind of emotions, sadness, rejection, or like feeling like you don't belong, how that feels in your body. Mind blank, numb. Yeah, like an anvil on me. Can't get it off me. Yeah. I always feel like so heavy and just like this, ooh, like this pull in my chest or this pit in my stomach. Yeah. And then the mind going blank and numb. And those are physiological changes of the body in freeze. And, sometimes we're like, why am I so tired? Why am I so tired? Because the body actually produces fatigue when we're in freeze. I found it so interesting. She said a couple of times that the critical voice comes along with the survival states, right? Yeah. And it's like she mentions how it's like those critical voices are actually not helping us. They're keeping us stuck. It's just kind of part of those feedback loops. But that's a good way to notice also that you're in a survival state, right? As I'm really critical of myself right now. I'm comparing myself. That's so insidious. Like I didn't realize how much I compare myself. Oh, I just want to be better. I just want to, dance like her. But then I'm feeling horrible inside. So I'm like, no, that's in the critical zone, not in the like, I'm dancing because it's fun and I enjoy her dancing because it's beautiful and I love when I dance too. The totally different feeling. But again, we're going to bounce in and out of these states. The main thing is not getting stuck there. And by knowing, we're on this continuum somewhere and how it feels to start getting back. So if you slide your hand back, you can start to even move along this path and feel what it feels like when you've been really shut down to start to have some of that activation again and start to say, you know what, I matter. Like I am going to change this. Like this is important to me. I deserve this. People can't treat me like that. Like even that kind of like starting to just feel like alive, and that can be moving through that continuum through the sympathetic and then towards the, okay, I'm safe to be alive. It's okay that I'm taking up space. I can connect with people. I can, like as you move along the continuum, not only do you start feeling safe, but then you're like, I'm going to like actually put myself out there and start like sharing my gifts and stretching myself to connect with other people and do these things in the world because I'm so grounded and safe. I can actually move out and, make a difference with things. Yeah. You guys like that? I love that idea of that continuum. And it sounds like you were really feeling those differences in your bodies too. And when we can do it here in this safe place, then when it comes up and we don't have to judge it and we can just know that that's what's going on, it makes it so much easier to come back to home. She talks about things being nourishing or depleting. So that's another just way of thinking of it. What is depleting to me and my energy? The patterns of thought, the patterns of action that I take, maybe where I'm going, things I'm, doing. And then nourishing. So we want to decrease the things that are depleting, but we also want to increase what's nourishing. So it's really good for us to start to notice those glimmers, what kinds of things fill us versus drain us. So I want you to think of a time that you've felt in that dorsal. And so that's where you're feeling shut down and collapsed and that feeling of draining. And then moving up that scale, imagine like filling a little bit, right? How that feels to like Again, you're moving through sympathetic, so it could have more life. It could have even a little bit of anger, right? You could be like, you know what? That's not okay. I'm not like, I'm not going to take that anymore. It's, I matter. I'm alive. And then how does that feel in the filling sense, right? So we're thinking of the nourishing, the filling. What other kinds of things, what other kinds of feelings do you feel with the filling, with the filling experience? Like, how does that feel in your body? And then you can think of times that you've felt, more energized and motivated and in that kind of sympathetic, and then how it could turn into that feeling of regulated and safe. And how does that feel? Like, can you think of a time in your life that you've been in flow, you've been actually doing things, but you're still not depleted? You're actually feeling, I keep saying feeling and feeling like together. Um, Feeling more like energized. Like I always do this with teaching yoga. I can go in and I feel at a certain energy level, and guaranteed by the end of teaching yoga, even though I've physically done things and I've been talking and I've been moving, my energy level is higher. But there are other things that I might go and do and talk the same amount, the same number of words, and feel depleted by. So just noticing what for you that feeling is, and noticing that it is independent of the action. Sometimes we're like, well, I don't want to be out in the world doing all these things. That sounds exhausting. But when you're coming from this ventral place and you're just stretching but not stressing, it is like actually energy giving, right? It's filling your cup. That's so cool. Okay, so she says this little, we won't go into this whole exercise, but it's so cute. It's like I'm so blank I could blank. So I'm so lonesome I could cry. I'm so happy I could sing. I'm so sad I could hide in my bed. Like, what are the kinds of things that come to mind when, if you describe those states, some of the emotions that you feel, and you say, I'm so blank, I'm so sad, I'm so triggered, I'm so angry, I'm so urgent. That seems weird, but you know what I mean? Like this flight, like, I'm so imperfect. what is what is normally coming up for you? What is the story right now? And then we could look at how you might be able to change that. If you could, on purpose, out of that context, think, okay, I'm so angry, I could, instead of scream, it could be like, I'm so angry, I could go for a run, or right, like I could get on my bike and pedal my feet so fast, or whatever. I'm so sad, I could cry. I mean, crying I think is good, but you could also say, I'm instead of like, I'm so collapsed, I just need to shut down, like, I'm so collapsed, I'm going to give myself some love right now. I'm going to show myself a break. I'm going to take care of myself, or something, right? And it could be the other stuff too. Instead of what you would say in the ventral state, I'm so happy I could sing, you might start to say on purpose, I'm so happy I could connect with my friend right now, or something like that. Like, if you want to, right? So you could start to see what the patterns are that you already have, what your autonomic nervous system is kind of telling you by what comes up with these statements. And then, how can we tweak them a little if we want to, right? Again, it's not like, okay, I want to arrange my life so that I never get sad again, but like, what are some things to resource when I'm sad? And how is it that I can look at this emotion as like, you know, how I want to act and soothe myself from there? Breathing is like just the best way, I think. Well, maybe not the best, but like, it's so nice to know that you can regulate your nervous system through breathing, because you always have your breath with you. Happens automatically, but you can also consciously control it. The times we start to get into problems are sometimes when we're trying to force ourselves to like just be calm and breathe slow. That can sometimes trigger our nervous system. So just be aware of any of these breathing exercises where you start to feel a little more sympathetic or shut down. You don't have to do the breathing exercise that way. There's so many different breathing exercises to do. So find one that's fitting for you. But in general, when we take longer exhales, that's more of the vagal brake. So calming the nervous system, going towards the dorsal side. But it doesn't mean necessarily a bad thing with shutting down. It's the vagus brake. So it's calming the or the sympathetic. Sorry. So but sometimes there are times like in yoga, they'll do this fire breath, which is a very quick to try to activate the system. So if you're in freeze, you might want to actually activate before you get to ventral. So just knowing those kinds of things with breath, like the short, quick breaths, you might be like, ooh, that means a bad thing. But actually, you could use that to your advantage to move yourself into the sympathetic state and then up further into ventral, right? So she does talk about adding movement to breath too, which I thought was kind of cool. And just even noticing that within the breath rhythm, there's like as you inhale, it is a little more of a sympathetic state. Your heart rate speeds up a little. And as you exhale, it calms down a little and your heart rate slows down. So as you, should we do this? We're not going to do the moving one. I was thinking of doing that, but let's just move on. There is an exercise about adding breath to movement. And then there's sighing that she talks about. And it's so interesting because, again, you can think of a sigh from those 3 different states. So just think of a sigh, and you could do a sigh right now that you are in that dorsal state. Imagine that you're shut down and you're like collapsed and you're like, oh, everything's hopeless. That kind of sigh, right? And then you could be in more of an activated state and sigh, like out of frustration. You're like angry and you're like, oh, it's not happening fast enough. And why isn't this person different? And why am I like this? And you could sigh from that. So imagine or actually sigh, in that state, imagining that state. And then as you're progressing up, you could almost have this sigh of relief of like, okay, it's all right. Everything's going to be okay. I have the support I need. I have the tools I need. Things are always working out for me. There could be this sigh that's like, things are going well. It's okay. This is good. So you could savor that sigh, in fact. A lot of times when we're coaching, we'll see people have a realization and there's this big sigh like, okay, oh, all right. That does make sense. It's like a reset to the nervous system. So that's a way of shaping is through the breath and through sighing. Feeling touched. I thought this was fascinating. There's a touch need that we have. We can be touch hungry or we can be touch filled. So like she has us do the continuum. On one end, you could have a touch filled. On one end, you could have a touch hungry, and you could determine where along that scale you are. And, touch can be a tricky thing, especially with other people, especially if there have been, traumatic things that have happened in the context of touch. So finding those safe touches, what feels good, and as far as safety and touch, and maybe it's petting your cat, and maybe it's doing self-touch, hugging yourself. And Michelle had said something about, oh, there's a few things in the chat. Someone had said something about hugging themselves, I think. Oh, a containment hug. This was Michelle. That helps calm my breathing. So Michelle, maybe if you want to even just say, if you're at a place where you can say for a second, I think a containment hug is like, do you have your hand against your rib on one side? Yeah.
The right hand under the left armpit, the left hand on the right shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
And within, I mean, it depends, it varies, but I usually start to yawn pretty quickly
Mm-hmm.
and or I lie on the floor
Mm-hmm.
and I become very conscious of where my body is touching. And I
Mm-hmm.
notice I get releases, not again, not all the time, but fairly often I notice the yawning starts, which I've been taught is survival energy releasing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I find myself, or I do the butterfly when
Yeah.
I'm overwhelmed.
Yeah. I love that.
I don't do that one as often as I do the hand under the armpit. That one for me is like my
Mm-hmm.
go-to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when I notice my breathing, sometimes it's like I'm so out already. You know
Yes.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Oh,
I
yeah.
I want to get better at
Yeah.
noticing, oh, my breathing is really shallow. Let me do a containment hug or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and that has really helped me because sometimes in the moment I don't know what to do with myself,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
I love
So
that.
that's helpful.
Yeah, that containment hug is so good too, because your hand is right by your heart. So you can,
Hmm.
imagine breathing into that right hand and
Yeah,
feeling that
yeah,
space expand. And
yeah.
yeah, that is such a good one. And yeah, I
Yeah,
was actually,
thanks for explaining that because I don't even think about like what is actually happening. All I know is
yeah,
okay, someone I follow told me that okay, I'm gonna do it. And I just do it.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
I'm like, it can't hurt.
It can't hurt.
It can't
Exactly. I
hurt.
mean, it is so soothing, and you could even add some rocking or,
Yeah, the
yeah,
rocking
all of
helps
those little
too.
things. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
just getting coached this morning, and my coach was like, just keep tapping on both shoulders at the same time as we're talking. And,
right.
those little things just help so
Yeah,
much to help stay
yeah,
grounded. And
yeah, yeah.
so, yeah, the
Thank you.
feeling of
Yeah,
touch, sometimes we're like, oh, we get, very, we want a certain kind of touch from a person who doesn't want to touch us in that way. You know what I mean? And that's not what we're talking about here. It's about, you know, noticing, yes, maybe I do like those kind of touch, and that's great to fill my cup, but also all of these other ways that I can add a loving touch, even if it's just by myself, because that, you want to build these reliable ways of soothing. Yeah. So let me make sure I got all the stuff in the chat. And oh, thanks for explaining it so well. It makes a difference. Oh, my pleasure. I'm glad. Okay, so I think we got all of that. And then this sounded so interesting. You could add a mirrored touch to self touch. So you could have another person engage in the same self touch, and then you follow. So I could just imagine this. I'm sure in some retreat somewhere, people do this, right? Where you're like, you do this, and then you mirror it with the other person, and you do this. And some of those little exercises can be so powerful of like, just like having this moment of presence with someone and mirroring what they're doing, and feeling seen and reciprocated, and so cool. But we're not going to do that today. I thought about like pairing us off, but that would be a whole thing. But this is what I love about this book. It is chock full of exercises. I mean, I swear every chapter has like 4 or 5 exercises that you can do. So if you're ever leading groups, or if you ever are like, struggling with an idea of how to come to that home ventral place, then this book is full of ideas. Michelle did the 5-minute self-compassion meditation last week. It was helpful. Good. Yeah. Was that in here? I forgot about that. Yeah. I think no. Okay. I was like, oh, okay. Self-compassion has been eluding me. Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's one of the hardest parts of this whole work, I think. And I think it is because we're so trained to look for the negatives in us and try to fix them, and, see that we actually change best through self-compassion, not through shaming ourselves. We don't shame ourselves into change. And yes, the negativity bias is real, Wendy. And yeah, you forget that self-compassion is available to you all the time. So, so true. And it's really hard with these nervous system things, especially sometimes it feels like the more we know, the more we can be judgmental of ourselves. Cause it's like, when I was oblivious, then I guess I can excuse all this stuff I did. But now that I know better, shouldn't I start acting better? And yes, over time we do in this shaping process, but it's not like just because we know better, our nervous system, is still trying to protect us. And it has years and years and years of patterns. Yeah, that was a great physiological sigh I just saw on camera. Yeah. I was relieved when Deb kept saying about negativity bias. Right. Like it's so helpful to just know these things are normal. This is how our brain is programmed to survive, right? It makes sense. We're not going to be like, oh, everything's good. That sounds dangerous, right? We want to be like, there's this danger, there's this danger. But on this continuum, we actually start to see when we start to see things are good, when we start to trust, when we start to have compassion for ourselves, that's when we can actually really start to thrive. We're not in the survival responses all the time. Ooh, Wendy, this is so good. Self-compassion feels so self-indulgent. Isn't it true though? And that's what I need more than anything. Yeah, it's this irony. We've like really trained ourselves to like any kind of, compassion or self-care or rest. We're like, oh, that is just self-indulgent. I'm never going to change if I, just like am nice to myself. But it's just that irony. So good we're learning this. Doesn't come naturally, but I've seen improvement. Yeah. And what I find too is like a lot of times like maybe I don't do it in the moment, but like after I'm like starting to be better about having more compassion, and it is a process, and sometimes it's easier than others, but at least knowing that this is automatic, this is programmed into us, that really helps me be self-compassionate, because then I'm not like, oh, okay, I'm just like weak as a human and I'm like bad and I'm like, an idiot. It's like, oh, I have a nervous system that does this stuff that I'm going to befriend it. I'm going to work with it, right? I'm going to partner with it. I love those types of ideas. Someone told me once, if things are feeling hard, it's an invitation to dial up the self-compassion. Yes. Yes. It's so true. It's like that should be our reminder. Put a new like connector in there of like, instead of going to shaming, go to self-compassion. Um, I was at that retreat with Peter Levine. I did a retreat with Peter Levine, and I got called up to be one of the participants. And I was like, I feel so unworthy, like to take the time and to, and he's like, when you, oh, how did he say it? When you ask yourself, am I unworthy? It's like asking yourself, can I be kind to myself? That's how he said it. Anyway, it was just like such a spin on it, because that's the times that we're usually the harshest and most critical of ourselves. And so, yeah, that invitation to self-compassion, it's like so counterintuitive. The world thinks you're crazy, right? They're just like, oh, so you're like, not going to beat yourself up for laying on the couch today. Yeah, I was in freeze. Makes sense. I did my best for what I could do. That's the way to get through it, not beating yourself up more, right? Okay, let's move on to restoring. I think a lot of us do this with coaching, right? I know a lot of coaches that are watching this or on this. So I think we're starting to do it with words pretty well, right? We can notice that there's like this way that I'm thinking and this thought pattern, and maybe I can soften that or I can change that. But we can, again, we see the world through these states. And so we could have one action, like she talks about spilling her coffee, and you could see it from the dorsal state. Oh, I'm hopeless. Oh, I never do anything right. Why am I so clumsy? I'm horrible. This is unfair. Okay. And then you could see spilling the coffee from the sympathetic state where you're like, oh, how did if I had just tried harder and if I just paid more attention, if I wasn't so incompetent, like that's that more activated, like you see these problems. Oh, I just should be better at this. And then the ventral state is just like, oh, whoops, that happens sometimes, like not a big deal, right? Like, oh, wow, whoops. And it's just an accident and just goes about your day, right? So think of some experience, any experience that comes to mind that's kind of been a little bit dysregulating lately. Yeah, I see. Oh, I so appreciate that she shares so honestly, even though she knows this stuff inside and out. Oh my gosh, right? Because we all have a nervous system, even when we know it. It's like having a toddler with us, right? You're like, sometimes a toddler gets dysregulated. That's just part of having a toddler. Could be the best toddler in the world, but they're not gonna, behave like an adult. So think of a time that you've gotten a little dysregulated lately, the experience, and think of how you're looking at it in from those different stories. What parts of the story come up, especially like thoughts, beliefs? Um, usually we have our own flavor of it. Mine is like, I don't do things right, or, people don't like me. But for someone else, it might be like, you know, everyone takes advantage of me, or like I can't trust people. Like, what comes up for you in these types of things? And can you tell it from another state now? Can you tell it from the sympathetic state? How might you feel that very same action happened, but you're more in the, self-critical or critical of others, fight or flight? And then if you guys all got that? If you think about it from the ventral state, that same thing happened. This reminds me of in David Hawking's Letting Go. He tells the story of a car accident, and he tells it from all of the different like emotional levels. And at some points you're like, oh no, this is horrible. At others you're like, and then the ventral one basically, or the like, happier one, is like, oh, I got this chance to like meet these new people, and oh, it's fine because I have car insurance and I'll get a rental car for a few days, and those are always fun. You know what I mean? It's just like these things in life are going to happen, and so we will perceive them differently depending on what state we're in, and then the story we tell will just amplify that state more, right? It'll be more of a feedback loop of that state of perpetuating our story. So it's good to know what our stories are. So again, we have one more clue of the rumble strips on the freeway. Oh, this is where I start like that person didn't ask me to dance, so I start thinking like, okay, well, nobody likes me and I'm like a bad dancer, and you know what I mean, right? Versus like that person had to use the restroom, or who knows what was going on. What I don't like, or yeah, what I don't like is that people often see that as being moody. Yeah. And that's so interesting, right? I talk to so many people, my line of work, people who have chronic pain, they're generally people who have big emotions, and they've had a life of being seen as, you know, they're not stable, they're moody. And what's funny is like usually they're not even angry people. Like it's usually more the like sad emotions. Cause like if you think about it, like the angry emotions are kind of more like, masculine, and you're just like, oh yeah, that's a normal thing. But like somehow when you're like crying, then that's moody and that's like unbalanced. Um, yeah, we have a lot of judgments about our emotions. That's why we have so many repressed emotions and chronic pain and dysregulated nervous systems. So she says you can change your stories through art, through movement, through words. So she said she loves words. She would rather do it through words than movement. She said for her, movement is not as comfortable to do. So it's totally okay if you're, like not like, okay, I'm going to go run 10 miles. Like that's not in my wheelhouse, but, maybe getting out my adult coloring book for a little while, or maybe like listening to some music, or, moving my body in my chair, or just changing the story with words is more accessible. The way she says to do it is, of course, gradually, and you can explore the new story. I love this. Like, first step, connect with the state of protection or connection. So the first step is to get as regulated as you can. Like, probably don't do this when you're in the height of your dysregulation, right? Just when you're like, everybody hates me and blah, 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 it's going to be hard to see a little better outlook. So don't get frustrated with yourself if it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It just means you need to anchor into safety a little bit more. And, there are breathing ways or other ways to do that. But like starting from this place of like, okay, it's okay that I'm feeling this old story. It's okay. This story is here. And let's get creative and let's be curious about it. So create an image to represent the state. So right now, if you're in a state of protection, what might that image be? And then listen to the story the image is showing you. So maybe someone said something like having like an anvil on them, right? And maybe it's like, I feel like I'm, being closed in a box, or you know what I mean? Just like, what is the image that comes to mind? And then change the image by adding or taking away one small element. So, maybe if that anvil was like feeling like it was on you, you're just able to like move it over to the side, or you're able to like lighten it a little bit, or maybe a string is pulling it up or something, right? So you're just like curious again. You can come up with your own, whatever your own subconscious tells you, or you just think of, and then stop and see what happens with your experience and with the story. So like maybe you're like, okay, well, all I have to do is like remove this anvil, and you go to do it in your mind, but then it feels worse, and then it feels like even heavier. So you want to stop and check in. You get this idea, okay, this is what I want to do to soften it or change it, and then check back in and just make sure it's going that direction that you want. Because again, the nervous system is going to work gradually. And with, there's this quote from her that I got from a live training, that the nervous system knows the subtle distinction between an invitation and a demand, right? So it's like, we want to invite, but we don't want to demand. Repeat the process until you feel you've reached the point where you've stretched enough and any more would take you into stress. Rest here in the new image and listen to the new story. Spend a moment savoring. So maybe I can just tell you a little quick example, because I told you I just got coached today. I had the craziest thing happen. Like, I was so dysregulated. I haven't felt that for a long time. And it was like it came out in like this fight with this person. He was asking me about my stuff, the stuff I love talking about, and I was telling him about pain, and he was just like, what study? Where did they do it? Who did this? Blah blah blah. And I just I got so triggered. I was like kind of embarrassed, but it was like 1 a.m. and I wasn't resourced, right? So I started just being like, why are you acting like this? And then he turns it on me, like, why are you acting like this? And then telling me how I have all this bad energy. And anyway, I'm like even still a little triggered talking about it, honestly, because it was very dysregulating. I ended up crying and fight or flight. I ended up leaving. And then the friend that I was there with just like never processed it with me. He never really went back to be like, yeah, it totally makes sense that you acted like this. So it was good that I got coached, but my story was a mess, right? I was just like blaming this guy, and then I was like feeling really victim-y, and I was yeah, even still dysregulated talking about it. But I also found that place for compassion where I was like, my nervous system, I had some flashbacks of my ex yelling at me, and how he would criticize me and shame me. And I was like, it makes sense that I had that reaction. It really, really does. But I was also making a lot of stories about how this guy doesn't care for me, the guy that didn't stand up for me. And so my coach was really like, let's just see that like that part of it isn't true. And so we worked on just being like, just because he didn't respond in the way you wanted him to doesn't mean he doesn't care. And so it just like, was like changing that landscape, changing that story just a little bit. My mind could actually see that. I'm like, okay, it does make sense that he's dysregulated too, and he doesn't want to talk about it. And I can see that. So just being, just having the ability to just like softly change. If she had just been like, no, he still loves you. Oh, don't even worry about it. It's fine. Then my nervous system would have outright rejected it. But for her to just be like, well, let's just see. You told me this and this, and it doesn't mean this. And so, you know what I mean? So anyway, it was just good to thank you, Wendy. You're like, thanks for being vulnerable and authentic with us right now. Yeah. I mean, and I was not even sure, honestly, if I wanted to share this because I was like, it was so like disorienting. It was like really weird to believe that even happened. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, it just shows my nervous system is just, gets in those moments when it's stretched very thin and I'm not resourced, you know, and someone's pushing your buttons. And anyway, it was such good learning and gives me a chance to like go through. And I was like so glad to have this book, even though I resisted doing this work for so long, because this just happened this weekend. I was like, when I did kind of dive into this book, I was like, oh, I actually feel good right now. um, Renee says, I have a friend that is a therapist, and she always says that the medium you're most uncomfortable with brings the biggest breakthroughs. So if you like to dance, try doing a drawing. And I found this to work. Ooh, that's very true, I bet. There's so much resistance I have to art. And every time I've done it, I'm like, oh, that was better than I thought. That was, much more fun than I thought. Because so much of it is like my doubt, oh, I'm not a good artist. And then you're like, oh, okay, well, that felt good to do it. Um, Helps me personally know that I'm not alone in moments that I've had recently. Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you guys for supporting me and framing it for not being resourced. Yeah, I think it really is a helpful frame for difficult situations because I mean, I went over that in my head probably 1,000 times and I was like, why did I react like that? Like why, I could have taken 3 seconds and looked up the study and said, oh, here it is. But my coach even helped me realize like you were in fawn. Like I was in fawn from the very beginning. I didn't want to talk to him about this at 1 a.m. I was there to see my friend. I was there to hang out with my friend, not this guy. And you know what I mean? Like there were so many factors that she was like, you were already in fawn just by the fact that you were like engaging in this conversation you didn't want to. And even that resonated with me so much. I was like, oh my gosh, I can even be more gentle with myself because I can see how, like I've been programmed to be like this. And maybe I could even it's hopeful. Maybe I could get to the point where I could be resourced enough to say, you know what, I would love to talk about this with you at a different time when I can give you my full attention and I can like, because this deserves a great conversation and my full attention. And I'm just not like resourced enough for that right now, but I would love to talk to you about it a different time. Yeah. And thank you. Yeah, I love that. So, but that's what we learn from this, right? We have the rupture and we have the repair. So, and maybe I'll repair it with this guy, or maybe it's just a repair with myself. And some old like trauma stuff came up that I'm like, you know what? I feel like there was a lot of trauma from my divorce that I never addressed. So this is like a piece of it that came up for me to, like make peace with and let go of. So in that way, it does feel like there's a purpose to it and that it's good. Real quick at the end, I'll end with the little story that she tells at the end of chapter 9, which is about a girl who has been taught to carry a canoe. So she grows up, near rivers. And so she has this canoe with her. And she as she journeys along, it's come in handy. And then she comes out of the water and starts carrying this canoe around. And it's like, breaking down trees and scaring the animals and getting in the way. But she's so used to carrying that canoe that it feels weird to not have it. And she keeps, the animals are like, hey, you can get rid of that canoe. And she's like, but what if I need it? And they basically at some point convince her to get rid of that canoe, and it's so much lighter, and she has now other resources. She has the animals to help her, and now she's not like scaring them all away. And she, so like that analogy of these survival strategies that we have, as they can seem protective to us when we're used to them, but they can weigh us down. And so when we start to let go of some of those old protective responses, how much more free we can feel. All right. Thanks, Michelle, for joining. All right, you guys. Well, whew, that was a lot. That felt good to share that with you guys. Thanks for all that reinforcement too. And so, yeah, just keep noticing with compassion those things in your life, because they will come even when you know this stuff, or even when you teach this stuff, or even when you believe it. And and it's so funny because that guy has been like watching my Instagram and watching all my story. I'm like, on one hand, I'm like, maybe he'll see the kind of person I am, really, but then I'm like, he'll see what he wants to. Like, I don't know, sometimes like your biggest haters, like they'll start following you and watching all your stuff. So I'm like, I don't know. But anyway, all right, thanks you guys. We'll try to get through the last 3 chapters next week. I think we can do it. We'll just get through what we get through. But there, obviously, we could have taken like 3 months to do this book instead of just 1 month, because it is just rich with so much information and good stuff. All right. Thanks, you guys. Yes, he's not my ideal client. No, exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing. And that's why part of the reason I was so bugged is I'm not in the business to try to convince people. Like, I am not going to go debate people. Like, that's not for me. So if you are loving it and you want to hear, I'm happy to share. But if you're like, if you want to argue with me about it, I'm not up for that. That's where I go home. All right, you guys. Thanks so much. You guys are awesome. Bye.